All right, Rob, so let's get one more chapter before we flip over to November and the Thanksgiving theme. Books Hilda Lewis, The Witch and the Priest, a novel based on the true story of Joan Flower, the infamous 17th century witch. And this is her familiar Rutterkin, the blood drinking, favor doing cat. Chapter 13. Samuel Fleming walked in the August garden. He walked slowly, feeble yet with his sickness, and as he walked, there came to his ears the purling of the river, a small bright river, innocent, yet he had known it to rise and flood and sweep a man away. He had been all but drowned himself once. He looked with pleasure at the bridge he had built. The little stone bridge, strong and beautiful. Yes, there it stood, and would stand. He had left money for its upkeep, so that ever after men could walk safely when they came to church. Yet there were things to do first, priest. She stood before him, translucent as the water. Men and women may take the long way to church when the river is in flood, which is not often, or the wooden bridge have served them still. But in this parish of yours, there are always some who shiver and shake. Yes, even this hot day, because of empty bellies and empty hearths. And when he would have answered that his sister saw to it that none went cold or hungry, she said quickly, Mistress Davenport is kind, but her soup, good though it be, is not enough. You cannot keep body and soul together with a sup now and then. A bit of bread and cheese from one's own shelf every day, punctual as the sun, and a warm fire may yet save souls for your God. There are some who make their pact with the Master to save themselves from the slow and bitter death of poverty. At this moment, Hester herself came across the lawn, the white cat at her heels. I thought I heard voices, she said, looking about her, surprised to find him alone. I was sure William was with you. I have to speak to him about my new bed of sparrow grass. He did not trench deep enough for all my talking. Now there is little, and that poor enough. Oh, she stopped and shivered. It is cold. Who would believe it is August? And yet, she looked up puzzled. The sun is as hot as my kitchen fire. But then, she went on, answering herself, as was her way, the wind blows cold from the river. She looked at it fondly. Who should suppose so small a river could make so great a difference? Well, Jeanette will bring you a shawl. She turned to go. Send Will to me if you see him, she said across her shoulder. There shall be plain speaking about the sparrow grass. Frances may come home suddenly. Who knows? And certainly there is none fit for Celia when she comes to dine. Frances is not likely to come for many a long day. More's the pity. As for Cecilia, there's enough to spare at Beaver. Still can't get over that word being beaver. But I looked it up and that I pushed that little pronunciation, but it goes beaver, beaver. I'm like, all right, buddy. That is not at all the same thing, she said, obstinate as some gentle women can be. It is my pleasure to give my guests the thing they like, whether they have it already or not. Besides, there is no sparrowgrass at Beaver, so sweet and juicy as mine. I had best go and find Will. Come, puss. The cat did not stir. She put out a hand, and it backed and spat. There it stood, 4 feet planted, back arched, spitting and glaring. What ails the creature? Hester said. What does he see? A ghost, perhaps? And who would blame any ghost for wandering abroad this sweet summer day? Behind him he heard Joan Flower laugh. Hester stared past him beneath her shielding hand. Yes, certainly Puss has seen a ghost, she said, and her laugh was uncertain. Come, Puss. And when the creature stood unmoving like a cat in snow, save for the quiver of its anger and the glowing of its eyes, he heard a voice behind him whisper, Go, cat, go. Hester's head turned sharply from right to left. I can believe in daylight ghosts, all but, she laughed. But again, her laugh had an edge to it. Come, puss. She turned towards the house, and the cat followed. If you must come, he told Joan Flower, then come where you can frighten no one. I have frightened no one, she said. As for her, she nodded in Hester's direction. She is more likely to frighten me. She is one of God's fighters. For all her gentleness, she gives no quarter. As to how I come or when or where, I take my chance as I may. We cannot go on like this forever. And so, priest, to the battle. He sighed, reluctant to leave the bright flowing water, and the garden with its roses nodding and blowing, and lilies pouring richness upon the warm air, and the heart's ease, and love lies bleeding, all enclosed in neat clipped box. I don't know what that phrasing is, but it's pretty good. His study had a greenish underwater look after the bright garden. The sky lifts a man's soul heavenward, he thought, and threw the casement wide so that the sunlight rushed in. He could hardly see her now in the strong light, but he heard her, felt her, knew her to be there. He wished he had not refused Hester's offer of a shawl, even indoors. With the sun streaming through the open window, he felt the piercing cold that came from her. Well, she asked, have you considered the things we spoke of yesterday? He nodded. That some poor souls are annoyed in prison. Tormented was the word, priest. It was a word he could not take as yet. He went on, I believe, and I am ashamed, I am bitterly ashamed, and I believe also you did not bewitch the Lady Catherine. And yet he leaned chin upon palm, cold as ice and stiff as iron, frothing at the mouth as her brothers had done, like them crying all wild with terror, staring with blind eyes, passing out of the body and returning not knowing what had passed. Strange, strange. She shrugged. Who can understand the heart of a child? Suffer the little children to come unto me, Samuel Fleming said softly. Certainly he understood. They ran and clasped him about the knees. You can draw any child with honey, she said, but understanding is a different thing. And your master, is he more understanding than the Son of God? Why, yes, the master loves little children, and he is more honest than your God, for you take the newborn babe and offer him to God. You baptize him with your holy water and with the mark of the cross, and he is too little to understand, and he is too weak to refuse. But often he cries aloud when it is done, and that is the thing you know well. But, my master, when we offer our children, he makes the mark, it is true, but he does not accept them. Not one does he accept. He waits until they are old enough to know what it is. What it is they do. Then he asks them, are you willing? And do you understand? And again, are you willing? Then and only then does he accept them. And he is very kind to children, and they have no fear of him. They run to his knees, and they embrace him about the neck, and they kiss his cheeks. And he calls them sweet names, bird and lamb and little hare, but he allows no child to fool him. The child who is not true is beaten until he comes weeping and cringing to the master's grace. Oh, he would have understood the little lady well enough. Sweet, he would have said, deceive whom you will, your God, if you can, and I shall praise you, but try to cheat me, and it will be a sorry day for you. Your last, perhaps. Oh, he would have seen through her saucy ladyship. When she knew all hearts heavy with grief, heard and prayers, saw the tears, and when she saw these hearts lift a little, when the sickness lifted, drop again, when the sickness dropped down again, why, then she felt herself left out, little lady in the cold. Yes, the master would have understood her very well. But, Samuel Fleming said, unwilling even to glance at the truth, she grieved. She truly grieved. More than once I wiped her tears, and we prayed together. I felt my own prayer stronger for a child's tears. Of course she grieved. Of course she prayed. Of course she wept. But do you not imagine that some of it, and not a little, was for the neglected little lady? No, she was not sick, though sometimes she feared she might be stricken. To envy the sick is not to desire the sickness. And when she found she did not sicken, why then she feigned the matter. So young and so cunning, it is not possible. You are over-trusting, priest. All children are cunning. Yet it could be that, in a while, the thing she feigned became real. In the end, maybe, she did not fully understand the game she played. The spell had failed. The little lady went free of us. My daughters took failure each in her way. To Meg, child of John Flower, it meant try no more. But Philip, begotten when the blood was hot, failure pricked on. She wore a keen and spiteful look, and I would watch her wondering what she meant to do. Oh, I knew well enough what she had threatened, but I could not believe it anything but threat. Margaret was, after all, her sister, and the thing was too horrible. Samuel Fleming saw the long shoulder that shook her body so that it moved and flickered like water. But if I did not believe it, Meg did. Fear had sharpened those dull wits of hers. She knew. And so time dragged on to the next Sabbath, Candlemas and the cold winter wind blowing and the cold stars pricking. She way overuses the word pricking, and I riding cold as a corpse with my fears, and as heavy lagging behind Margaret rode. There was a lost look about her as though she carried a dead thing within her. And indeed, I think she carried her dead child in her heart. It is not given to every woman, priest, to be a witch any more than every man can be a saint. Philip flew, spurring on her mount, all impatience to be there. She had neither stick nor familiar to carry her, but her mount bore the tormented face of Tom Simpson, a poor creature abused and bedeviled. She had bewitched him so that he must carry her wherever she commanded. And when he did not carry her fast enough, she struck him in the eye with her naked heel and beat upon his back with a wand so that the stripes showed bloody. Did she just say Tom Simpson was flying her through the air? All right, she was lit with her malice, and I thought, small wonder the master loves her above us all. I did not know then that already he was angered by her folly and wearied of her presumption, for she set herself above all others, even the oldest and the wisest. I did not know that already the captain had been at the master's ear, though I might have guessed it, for I had heard her declare, and not once neither, that soon the master would see the captain aside and name her coven maiden in his place. So I did not know that already the days of her life were numbered, and within them Margaret's days, and my days also. And so we came to the place of the Sabbath. For the first time I was not eager, neither for the rites nor the feast. For myself I was not afraid. I had done those tasks that fell to my hand. No great evil, certainly, and not continual evil. It was not to be expected. The soul can no more bear the weight of continual evil than the weight of continual good. Good and bad is the natural lot of us all, saint and sinner alike. We began, as always, with the adoration of the Master. When we had saluted him in a ring with uplifted foot, the circle broke and the long line moved before him. And all the time my heart was sick with fear. I saw Philip at the head rise on tiptoe to reach the light between his horns. Her grave, thin face bent downwards to her own candle. Her long fingers shielded its flame. I tried to tell myself that there was no malice here, but it was no comfort. Philip would perform the rites with due solemnity, whatever should come later. Behind that quiet face, her anger burned. I moved in my turn and stood before him, seeking to pluck some message from his face. Through the black mask, the eyes stared blank as stone. I moved on. And now it was Meg's turn to stand before the god. And as she stood, I saw the hand holding the candle tremble so that she could not light it. The line, slow moving, dropped to a halt, and we stood watching. The hand holding the candle jerked from left to right. Not one had pity for my wretched child, and in my own heart, greater than pity, was fear. And priest, the fear was for myself. So in the silence we waited, and he with us, a god in stone. How long she stood there trying to kindle the light, I do not know. But at last the thing was done. It was done, and we made as though to move again. She took a half step forward, and then the shudder took her. Her whole body shook, all rigid, like that of the dying. I half expected to hear the rattle in her throat. The lighted candle fell from her hand. We stood, not daring to believe the thing we saw, the blue flame drop and disappear in the black earth. Such a thing within the knowledge of the oldest witch had never happened. A groan went up, one long groan like the voice of all despair, but still the master said nothing. I caught sight of my younger daughter. There was the faintest smile about her half-open mouth. I saw the master sign to Margaret to drop out, and the worshippers moved on. But it was not the end, for having performed the lighting of the lights, we must move again to give the homage of the kiss. And all the time Margaret sat apart on the ground, her face in her hands, hidden by the long fall of her hair. And so she continued and did not offer the kiss, nor did he ask it. and that too had never been known. Then he gave us the signal that we might sit, and we sat silent, facing his throne. Now it was the time for us to tell of the work we had done to his glory, and my fear mounted as one by one we stood to speak. Ellen Green had robbed the grave of 2 infants, and would have robbed more. Had she not been disturbed, she had brought a great pot of fat. We should not go short of our ointment for many a day. The man Randall had bespelled the sheep of Sir George Manor so that they sickened and died, they and their lambs with them. And for this, an innocent man, William Barry of Langhorne, went to the gallows. Joan Wilmot had bewitched the pigs of one who had given her stale bread instead of fresh, and for the same reason she had cursed the wife of Anthony Gill over at Frisbee, so that the good wife and her child died together. As for myself, do you remember, priest, when your orchard failed? The fruit hung full and sound, yet overnight it crawled with maggots and had to be burnt. He nodded. That was my work. Mistress Davenport, meeting me in the village, had taken it upon herself to scold me, that I came to church no more, and that the lights of my house shone till daylight, and the noise of our junketing disturbed the quiet night. Nor did she care who heard her words, and I put the curse upon her black pig so that it ran this way and that, and swelled and died. And so it went on, each one standing with his tail. And always the same tale, Samuel Fleming sighed. The fields of the good man blasted, the fruits of the bad man prospered. A crow, a sheep, an ox, or a pig bewitched to its death. And a child here and there also, she reminded him, smiling. Do not forget the children. I am not likely to forget them. A fair calendar, I should have rejoiced, and yet, sitting there, I began to wonder if this were all to life, the working of small evils and the trembling of the soul that we had not found sufficient for our hands to do. And when this life was done, would it be as the Master promised, eating and drinking and the satisfying of desire? And if that were so, what did he promise that we had not already here upon earth? Surely eternal life should promise something better than the life we know. For the first time I began to doubt. God was working in you, Samuel Fleming said. She shook her head. Why should he? I had renounced my baptism and all hope of part in him. He is more merciful than human soul can conceive. It was a pity he did not show it that night, for still it went on and on, one after another offering his evil at the feet of the Master. And once again it was Margaret's turn. She made no move. She sat there in the midst of us, yet she alone, abandoned, cast off, and my fear grew, the fear that was both for her and for me. Hers was a soul not worth the bargain. I had cheated the Master, and the girl too I had cheated. I had promised her eternal joys, but it was a path too fearful for her feet to tread. I had brought her along that path, and there was neither going forward nor backward. Now, in the awful silence, the eye of the Master turned upon her. But still she sat, fingers clasped, so that the shining bone glistened through the skin like ivory, and her fair hair falling about her face and about her neck and about her bosom. And all the time she neither spoke nor heard nor knew what happened. And in the silence the Master spoke. It was not the roaring of the thunder, not the bellowing of a great beast, but a little voice, a still small voice. This is an old trick, Samuel Fleming said. The God of the Jews used it in the dawn of time. But the Son of Man spoke always man to man. Can your Master do nothing better than copy so stale a trick? Where the hell is this page corner turned? Thank you. It is his own trick, older by far than the God of the Jews, and it works. It works yet, priest. My heart stood still. Stand up, the small voice said. Stand up, my servant, and speak. And when she did not move, the captain went to her and took her roughly by the shoulder and dragged her to her feet. She stood there, and every limb shook so that it was a marvel she did not fall. I could not look at her. I was her mother, and I had brought her to this. She stood staring out of blind blue eyes. What deeds have you performed for love of me? The Master asked. I saw her swallow in her throat. I saw her tongue move across her lips. Her mouth began to move, but it was hard to catch the words. Lord, Lord, she said. And then, we worked the spell, but it failed. It failed. Her voice died away, and all about her the silence waited. It failed, she said again. The familiar refused. The familiar refused, and the small, quiet voice, the little, gentle voice, stiffened the blood in my veins. We shall deal with the familiar. Her lips just moved, but no sound came. O priest, then was the time for your God to speak, but he did not speak. And she stood there with her empty eyes and her dropped jaw, and her mouth fallen like the mouth of the dead. Philip sprang up in the moonlight. She was tight as a bowstring when the arrow was fitted, and I knew that thing I had feared was upon us. But I was no longer afraid. I looked at her all wild and cruel, and I felt my soul move towards her as yours, priest, might move towards a saint. There was no pity in me now, but only a hateful joy because of the pain to fall upon the daughter that had brought shame upon me. I looked upon the daughter who covered my shame with her own glory. Lord, she said, and came forward and knelt. Let your servant speak. And when he nodded, she said, it is right that there be punishment for failure, but punishment should fall where it belongs. It belongs not to the poor familiar, but to the one that blighted the spell in the binding. He said nothing, nor did he move. Lord, she said, and there was no fear in her. We had agreed that the three of us to cast the spells to bring all the children to their death, and afterwards to blast the seed of the father in the womb of the mother. And we bound ourselves in full meeting in your name. So it was, Lord. He stood up in his place. Was it not so? He asked of us. Lord, it was so, we answered him, and nodded our heads. Philip turned her wild head upon her shoulder and stretched a finger towards Margaret. It was she blasted the spell in the making, for we cast it watchful that nothing go wrong. But she sat there and set her will against us. But we didn't know it, my mother and I, until we rubbed the kerchief upon the belly of the familiar. For when we commanded him, go upward, he crouched with eyes of fire and could not stir against her will. Then my mother said, the spell is spoilt, but my sister said nothing. She stood up and went away, and after that we dared not cast the spell again, until we had consulted with our Lord and confessed and bowed ourselves to his command. Lord, what must we do? We must strengthen the will of our servant towards ourselves, he said, still in that small, quiet voice. And then he spoke not at all, but sat, masked face upon his hand, and we crouched still as any stone and watched lest our breathing sound too loud. And so sitting, the excitement died out of me, and I wondered what punishment he would inflict upon my girl. His lightest punishment, whipping, I had suffered myself over Panshin's child, and I had not found it so light. She moved her shoulders as though even now, out of the body, she felt the pain of the blows. As for the hardest punishment, it might be stoning, and though Margaret was worthy of death, I did not want to see her die cruelly before my eyes. He raised his head at last. His voice was cold as well water. This backsliding servant of mine does not know me. She has forgotten the night she offered herself to my service. When my servant forgets the embraces of the God, then it is time for her to die the death. But because she sacrificed her newborn child, I will show mercy, that she may hereafter remember the God. My choice tonight falls upon her. Witches, to the feast. The sweet savors of roast and broiled came up to our nostrils, but Margaret, going to her place, the last place of all, cried out that it was the flesh of infants. I rallied her that she was fanciful. As a breeding woman, it was nothing but pork and mutton. Margaret had been chosen of the master, but tonight there was not one that would willingly lie in her place. There she sat, lower than the youngest child in a lost and lonely world. The master did not look at her. He played with Philip, and they ate and laughed and kissed together, she lying upon his breast. But Margaret sat upright and looked before her, and no crumb passed her lips. At last, when we had eaten, the captain stood up and cried out, "Witches, to the dance!" So we ran to make our ring about the god, and the dance of the adoration began. I looked about for Margaret. She had not taken her place, but sat upon the ground. No one called to her, and if he had, I doubt she would have heard. There was nothing to do but throw my head back with the others and move in the measure of the dance, singing the hymn that never before failed to waken desire in me. It is a desire, priest, more than the common delight of women. For singing, I would feel within myself the quickening of the fertile earth and be at one with it. But tonight I felt nothing, only fear and sorrow and the anger of the god. The whole company felt it too, in spite of the flute. Forever quickening, our feet slowed and we came to a halt. Nor was it better when we came to the dances of our delight, which are not to praise the god, but to warm us for our sport. At a nod from the master, the captain flung his flute upon the ground and cried out, "Witches to the sport!" So we stood still while our partners came to fetch us. To every woman her incubus, to every man his succubus. But still Margaret sat unmoving on the ground. Philip left her place by the captain and stood over against Margaret. "Stand up, fool," she said, and the noise of her hissing came clear. "If you show yourself a coward, the master will tear you in pieces. Show some pleasure if you cannot show ardor. It is the only way to save yourself." But still Margaret sat in her place, and still the master waited. He was black as coal, and his horns jigged away, this way and that, as the wind blew the flame of the candle that was set between them. And as he stood, the muscles beneath the shining skin ripped sleek with the power and the cruelty that was in him. And so we stood waiting until it pleased him to move. Margaret stood up on her place, and all the time he stood there and gave no signs. So inch by inch, moving against her will, she came towards him. And then it began, the thin, sweet sound of pipes that stirred the blood, and the pounding of tabors that beat their rhythm within the womb. But still as I lay with my incubus, my mind was less upon my delight than upon my girl. And once I heard a wild scream and raised myself to listen. "Lie still, sweetheart, till our business is done," he said, and pulled me down again. Dawn was coming up faint in the east. The pipes and tabors slackened and stopped, and we came yawning from our embraces. I saw Philip, sleepy as a cat, mount her tormented steed. She cut at him with a sharp switch and turned his head towards home. But weary as I was, and all longing for my bed, I could not leave the place until I had seen Margaret, that scream still in my ears. So there in the empty place, all churned with our feet, its bushes broken by our bodies, and the stink of spent candles in the air, I waited, and then I saw her. She was covered with blood, mouth and arms and white body abloom with scarlet, and her face was stiff as stone, and her eyes were no longer blank. They were quick with horror, quick and sick. If she could have wept then, though her heart dissolved in its flood, and her spirit took flight to the nethermost pit, then she would have wept. For the thing we missed sorest and agonized to win again, but cannot win again, is the power to weep. And you will have to wait for a later date for the remainder of this book. What are we, over halfway through now? Yes, we are. And that is all for now. Until next time, when we come back with some Thanksgiving books and a murder book that happened on Thanksgiving some decades ago. Goodbye, bros. Goodbye.